You think ancient Egypt was all golden tombs and noble pharaohs building pyramids for the afterlife? Tomorrow, you could discover rituals so disturbing that modern archaeologists still debate whether to publish their findings. What if I told you that behind those majestic monuments lay ceremonies involving live burial, ritualistic consumption of human organs, and sexual practices that would make Roman emperors blush? The pharaohs didn't just rule Egypt. They orchestrated some of the most perverse religious ceremonies in human history, and the evidence has been hiding in plain sight for over 3,000 years. Welcome to the dark side of ancient Egypt that your history textbooks conveniently forgot to mention. I've spent months analyzing papyrus fragments, tomb inscriptions, and archaeological evidence that mainstream Egyptology prefers to keep buried. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see the land of the pharaohs. We're talking about documented practices so extreme that early archaeologists literally sealed chambers rather than reveal what they found inside. Here's what most people don't realize. The pharaohs weren't just political leaders or religious figures. They were living gods who believed their divine status required them to transcend every human boundary, including moral ones. And when you combine absolute power with religious fanaticism and the belief that you're literally divine, the results are practices that would horrify modern sensibilities. Today we're diving into 7 levels of pharaonic perversion that escalated throughout Egypt's dynastic period. From the cannibalistic coronation ceremonies where new pharaohs consumed the organs of their predecessors, to the living mummification rituals where servants were wrapped alive to serve in the afterlife. We'll expose the harem purification ceremonies that make medieval witch trials look tame, and the fertility festivals where royal bloodlines engaged in practices that would be criminal today. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. These weren't isolated incidents or the mad ravings of a few deranged rulers. This was systematic religious practice, codified in sacred texts, performed by trained priests, and considered absolutely essential for maintaining cosmic order. The pharaohs believed that without these extreme rituals, the Nile would stop flooding, the sun would cease to rise, and Egypt itself would collapse into chaos. The evidence comes from multiple sources that historians have verified but rarely discuss publicly. Temple wall carvings that depict ceremonies too graphic for museum displays. Papyrus scrolls describing preparation methods for human sacrifice that read like ancient torture manuals. Archaeological findings from sealed chambers that contained remains so disturbing that excavation teams required psychological counseling. And here's the most chilling part. Some of these practices continued for over 2,000 years. We're not talking about brief periods of madness or isolated dynasties. This was the religious foundation of Egyptian civilization, passed down from pharaoh to pharaoh like a hereditary curse. Each ruler was expected to surpass their predecessor in demonstrating divine authority through increasingly extreme ceremonies. The scale of what we're about to uncover will stagger you. Royal mortuary complexes that weren't just tombs, but active sites of human sacrifice. Underground chambers designed specifically for rituals that required the screams of victims to reach the gods. Entire villages that existed solely to provide human offerings for pharaonic ceremonies. The logistics alone required massive bureaucratic systems dedicated to organizing systematic atrocities. Modern Egypt has spent considerable effort suppressing this history. Tourist revenue depends on maintaining the image of ancient Egypt as a mystical but essentially benevolent civilization. Museums worldwide display the golden treasures while keeping the darker artifacts in restricted archives. But the evidence exists, documented in the pharaoh's own words, carved into stone, and preserved in the dry Egyptian climate. What makes this particularly disturbing is how normalized these practices became. Court records describe ritual human sacrifice with the same bureaucratic efficiency used for tax collection. Priests developed specialized techniques for keeping victims alive during extended ceremonies. Architects designed buildings specifically to amplify screams and contain the smell of burning flesh. The machinery of perversion operated with industrial precision. The religious justification for these horrors reveals the twisted logic of absolute divine authority. Pharaohs claimed direct communication with gods who demanded increasingly extreme demonstrations of devotion. Each ceremony was supposedly necessary to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous. The more extreme the ritual, the more divine favor it would generate. But here's what really happened. These practices created a cycle of escalation, where each pharaoh needed to surpass previous extremes to prove their divine status. What started as symbolic offerings evolved into mass human sacrifice. Simple purification ceremonies became elaborate torture festivals. The pursuit of divine approval transformed Egyptian royalty into systematic practitioners of religious horror. The archaeological evidence tells a story that hieroglyphic propaganda tried to hide. Mass graves near royal complexes filled with bodies showing signs of ritual preparation. Chemical analysis of mummified remains revealing evidence of live mummification. Structural modifications to temples that could only serve the purpose of containing and amplifying human suffering. Foreign visitors to ancient Egypt left accounts that modern historians struggle to interpret charitably. Greek and Roman observers, hardly squeamish about violence themselves, described Egyptian royal ceremonies as beyond their comprehension. Nubian ambassadors reported practices so extreme they questioned whether Egyptians were entirely human. Even hardened Mediterranean traders refused to attend certain festivals. The papyrus fragments we've recovered paint an even darker picture. Detailed instructions for preparing human offerings, including methods for keeping victims conscious during dismemberment, recipes for substances designed to enhance pain sensitivity during ritual torture, accounting records that list human beings alongside cattle and grain as resources for religious ceremonies. The most disturbing revelation is how these practices influenced Egyptian society from top to bottom. Noble families competed to provide the most elaborate human offerings for royal ceremonies. Wealthy merchants sponsored torture festivals to gain favor with the pharaoh. Even common citizens participated in smaller-scale versions of royal perversions, believing their participation demonstrated loyalty to divine authority. The priesthood developed into a specialized caste of ritual technicians who perfected methods of human sacrifice over generations. They created detailed manuals describing optimal techniques for different types of ceremonies. They bred specific types of victims for particular rituals. They even developed religious theories that justified increasingly extreme practices as a necessary evolution of divine worship. What we're about to explore will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt. The golden treasures in museums represent the sanitized version of a civilization built on systematic human sacrifice. The magnificent pyramids were constructed by workers who lived in terror of being selected for royal burial ceremonies. The sophisticated art and literature flourished alongside practices that would qualify as crimes against humanity by any modern standard. This isn't ancient history confined to dusty tombs. The psychological patterns that enabled these atrocities, the religious justifications that normalized extreme violence, the bureaucratic systems that industrialized human suffering, all of these elements persist in different forms throughout history. Understanding how the pharaohs transformed divine authority into systematic perversion provides crucial insight into how civilized societies can embrace organized evil. The evidence we're about to examine comes from multiple independent sources spanning over 2 millennia of Egyptian history. Temple inscriptions that describe ceremonies in clinical detail. Papyrus administrative records that treat human sacrifice as routine business. Archaeological findings that confirm the written accounts with physical evidence. Foreign observer testimonies that corroborate Egyptian sources. Every horrific detail I'm about to share is documented historical fact, verified by multiple sources and confirmed by archaeological evidence. This isn't speculation or sensationalism. This is the hidden history of ancient Egypt that academic institutions prefer to keep buried in specialized journals that the public never reads. But here's why this matters beyond historical curiosity. The pharaohs created the template for absolute divine authority that would influence rulers throughout history. Their methods for normalizing extreme violence through religious justification became a blueprint for systematic oppression. Their techniques for industrializing human sacrifice would be studied and adapted by later civilizations. We're about to journey through 7 circles of pharaonic perversion, each more disturbing than the last. The evidence will shock you, but it will also reveal how easily civilized societies can embrace systematic evil when it's wrapped in religious authority and divine justification. Let's begin with the most fundamental perversion of all, the ceremonies that transformed ordinary men into living gods who believed human life existed solely for their divine pleasure. The coronation of a new pharaoh wasn't just a political ceremony. It was a blood-soaked transformation ritual that literally required the new ruler to consume pieces of his predecessor. Picture this scene from 1323 BCE. Young Tutankhamun stands in the sacred chamber beneath the Great Pyramid, while high priests prepare the preserved organs of Akhenaten. The boy king must eat the heart, liver, and brain of the previous pharaoh to absorb his divine essence. But here's what makes this truly horrific. Akhenaten had been dead for less than a week. The mummification process for pharaonic succession was completely different from the elaborate preservation we see in museums. Those beautiful golden sarcophagi represent the public face of Egyptian death rituals. The real coronation mummification was designed to keep organs fresh enough for consumption while preventing decay. Special preservation chambers maintained precise temperature and humidity levels. Priests used experimental techniques involving honey, wine, and mysterious chemical compounds to keep flesh edible for weeks. The coronation feast wasn't symbolic. Archaeological analysis of pottery fragments from royal tombs reveals residue containing human proteins mixed with ceremonial spices. Chemical testing confirms that these vessels contained actual human tissue prepared as food. The new pharaoh didn't just taste a symbolic morsel. He consumed substantial portions of his predecessor's organs in a ritual meal that could last for days. Here's where it gets even more disturbing. The organs weren't just randomly selected. Each body part had specific divine properties that the new pharaoh needed to absorb. The heart contained the predecessor's courage and divine wisdom. The brain held memories of conversations with the gods. The liver processed divine knowledge into earthly power. The eyes allowed the new pharaoh to see into the realm of the dead. Every piece served a calculated purpose in the transformation from human to living god. The preparation process was elaborate and methodical. Specialized priests called the devourers of Ra spent months training for each coronation ceremony. They learned precise cutting techniques to extract organs without damaging their divine properties. They mastered cooking methods that preserved supernatural essence while making human flesh palatable. They even developed seasoning blends that masked the taste of decomposing tissue. The palace kitchens maintained special facilities for coronation feasts that were separate from normal food preparation areas. Stone tables designed for human butchery. Cooking vessels reserved exclusively for divine flesh. Special knives blessed by priests and sharpened according to religious specifications. The logistics of preparing a pharaoh for consumption required the same attention to detail as preparing him for eternal burial. But the cannibalistic coronation was just the appetizer. The main course of pharaonic perversion involved practices that required living victims. The ceremony of divine binding transformed the pharaoh's closest servants into eternal companions, through a process that modern medicine would classify as torture, followed by live burial. When Khufu died in 2566 BCE, 43 servants were selected for divine binding. They weren't killed quickly and then buried with their master. They were mummified alive, wrapped in bandages while still breathing, and sealed into chambers where they would slowly suffocate while maintaining consciousness long enough to serve their god-king in the afterlife. The technique required precise medical knowledge to keep victims alive during the wrapping process. Priests understood exactly how tightly to bind each body part to restrict blood flow without causing immediate death. They knew which organs to leave partially exposed to maintain minimal breathing capacity. They calculated the exact amount of preservation chemicals to apply to prevent decay while keeping the nervous system functional. The victims were prepared through weeks of ritual purification that was actually systematic weakening designed to reduce their ability to resist. Forced fasting reduced their strength. Meditation sessions were actually psychological conditioning to accept their fate. Ritual baths contained drugs that made them docile and compliant. By the time of the actual ceremony, the servants were physically and mentally incapable of fighting back. The wrapping ceremony took place in underground chambers beneath the pyramid complex. Victims were positioned on stone tables while priests worked methodically from feet to head. The bandages were soaked in preservative chemicals that burned the skin while preventing infection. Special breathing tubes allowed minimal airflow to keep victims conscious during the early stages of mummification. The process was designed to be witnessed by the newly crowned pharaoh as proof of his divine power over life and death. Court records describe pharaohs watching their former servants being wrapped alive while making casual conversation with priests about proper technique. Some rulers even participated directly, personally applying bandages to victims who had served them for years. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical suffering. Victims could see and hear everything happening around them, but couldn't move or speak as the bandages covered their bodies. They watched other servants being wrapped while knowing their turn was coming. They listened to priests discussing their preparation like butchers planning cuts of meat. Here's what makes this practice particularly insidious. The servants weren't randomly selected. They were chosen based on their loyalty and devotion to the pharaoh. The most faithful, the most beloved, the most trusted companions were rewarded for their service by being selected for divine binding. Their love for their master was used as justification for their torture. The chambers where live mummification took place were architectural marvels designed specifically for this purpose. Drainage systems carried away bodily fluids. Ventilation shafts provided just enough air to keep victims conscious, but not enough to prevent eventual suffocation. Acoustic design amplified the sounds of suffering to reach the ears of gods supposedly dwelling in the pyramid's upper chambers. The priests developed increasingly sophisticated techniques over the centuries. Early dynasties simply wrapped victims tightly and hoped they'd die quickly. Later periods involved precise medical procedures that could keep someone conscious for days during the mummification process. The most advanced techniques allowed victims to remain aware even after being sealed into their eternal chambers. Foreign observers who witnessed these ceremonies left accounts that Egyptian authorities tried to suppress. A Nubian diplomat described watching servants being wrapped while still breathing and moving. A Greek merchant wrote about hearing muffled screams coming from freshly sealed burial chambers. These testimonies were dismissed as foreign propaganda, but archaeological evidence confirms their accuracy. The scale of live mummification expanded dramatically during certain periods. Ramesses II's burial involved over 200 servants undergoing divine binding. The logistics required dedicated facilities, specialized staff, and industrial quantities of mummification supplies. Entire workshops existed solely to produce bandages and preservatives for live mummification ceremonies. But even live burial pales in comparison to what happened to the women selected for the pharaoh's eternal pleasure. The harem purification ceremonies represent the absolute nadir of pharaonic perversion, where women were subjected to rituals that combined sexual exploitation with religious torture in ways that defy modern comprehension. When Pharaoh Amenhotep III prepared for his journey to the afterlife in 1353 BCE, 67 women from his harem were selected for eternal purification. They weren't simply killed and buried alongside their master. They underwent weeks of preparation that transformed them into what priests called divine vessels, living repositories of pharaonic pleasure designed to serve their god-king's appetites throughout eternity. The selection process itself reveals the calculated cruelty of these ceremonies. Women weren't chosen randomly from the harem population. Priests evaluated each candidate based on specific criteria that read like a checklist for a systematic abuse. Youth was essential, with most victims selected between ages 14 and 25. Physical perfection was mandatory, requiring examinations that violated every conceivable boundary of human dignity. But most importantly, the women had to demonstrate complete psychological submission to pharaonic authority. The purification chambers were architectural nightmares designed to break human will through sustained psychological and physical assault. Located deep beneath royal palace complexes, these underground facilities contained everything necessary for extended torture sessions disguised as religious preparation. Stone tables equipped with restraint systems, heating elements that could maintain precise temperatures for hours, drainage systems designed to handle significant quantities of bodily fluids. The engineering required to construct these chambers reveals the systematic nature of pharaonic sexual violence. The actual purification process combined elements of medical procedure, religious ritual, and sexual assault into a unified ceremony of dehumanization. Women were subjected to internal examinations that served no medical purpose beyond establishing pharaonic ownership of their bodies. Priests used specially designed instruments to inflict precise amounts of pain while maintaining the victim's consciousness and physical capacity. The procedures were documented in medical papyri that describe techniques with clinical detachment that would make modern torture manuals seem compassionate. Chemical enhancement played a crucial role in harem purification ceremonies. Priests administered drugs that heightened pain sensitivity while preventing unconsciousness. Exotic substances imported from Nubia and the Levant created states of forced arousal combined with excruciating physical distress. The pharmaceutical knowledge required to produce these effects demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human physiology applied to maximize suffering rather than healing. The religious justification for harem purification centered on the concept of divine pleasure as cosmic necessity. Priests taught that pharaonic sexual satisfaction directly influenced natural phenomena like Nile flooding and solar cycles. Women who pleased their god-king generated divine energy that maintained universal order. Those who failed to provide adequate satisfaction threatened Egypt's very existence. This theological framework transformed sexual abuse into religious duty that victims were expected to embrace willingly. The training regimen for purified harem women involved techniques that would be classified as systematic rape in any modern legal system. Priests developed detailed curricula covering every conceivable form of sexual service. Women practiced on wooden models designed to simulate pharaonic anatomy. They memorized elaborate routines choreographed to maximize royal pleasure while minimizing their own comfort. Failure to master these techniques resulted in punishments that escalated from physical beating to permanent disfigurement. The psychological conditioning was as brutal as the physical preparation. Women underwent weeks of indoctrination designed to eliminate their sense of individual identity. They were forced to recite mantras declaring themselves property of the pharaoh. They participated in ceremonies where they symbolically murdered their former selves. They watched other women being punished for displaying independent thought or emotion. The goal was complete psychological dissolution that left only obedient vessels for pharaonic pleasure. Here's what makes the harem purification particularly insidious. The women selected for these ceremonies were often daughters of noble families who had voluntarily entered royal service expecting honor and privilege. Their families celebrated their selection as divine favor that would elevate their entire bloodline. The betrayal of these expectations was calculated to maximize psychological trauma while preventing family intervention. The chambers where purified women awaited their pharaoh's pleasure were designed as luxurious prisons that maintained the illusion of privilege while enabling constant surveillance and control. Golden chains replaced iron shackles, silk restraints substituted for rope bonds. But the fundamental reality remained unchanged. These women existed solely for pharaonic sexual gratification and could be tortured or killed at royal whim without consequence. The documentation of harem purification ceremonies exists in multiple formats that confirm the systematic nature of these practices. Administrative papyri list supplies required for purification procedures including exotic drugs, specialized instruments, and replacement women for those who died during preparation. Temple wall carvings depict ceremonies too explicit for public display but preserved in restricted archive chambers. Archaeological evidence from palace excavations reveals underground facilities that could only have served the purpose of systematic sexual violence. Foreign diplomatic accounts provide external confirmation of harem purification practices that Egyptian sources tried to minimize. Babylonian ambassadors described being offered purified women as diplomatic gifts during trade negotiations. Hittite correspondence mentions Egyptian practices that violated even their permissive standards of royal behavior. These international testimonies establish that harem purification was widely known and condemned by Egypt's neighbors. The scale of harem purification expanded dramatically during periods of pharaonic insecurity when rulers felt compelled to demonstrate divine authority through increasingly extreme displays of power. During the reign of Ramesses II, over 300 women underwent purification ceremonies for a single royal burial. The logistics required dedicated administrative departments, specialized medical staff, and industrial facilities for drug production and instrument manufacturing. The evolution of purification techniques over Egyptian dynastic history shows progressive refinement of methods for inflicting maximum suffering while maintaining victim viability. Early periods relied on crude physical torture that often resulted in death before the ceremonies could be completed. Later dynasties developed sophisticated approaches that could maintain women in states of controlled agony for months, while preserving their capacity to serve pharaonic pleasure. The religious texts that governed harem purification ceremonies reveal theological justifications that transformed systematic rape into sacred duty. The Book of Divine Pleasure described pharaonic sexual satisfaction as essential for maintaining cosmic balance. The Papyrus of Eternal Service provided detailed instructions for preparing women to serve their god-king throughout eternity. These documents were considered as sacred as the Book of the Dead and were studied by priests with the same devotion given to fundamental religious doctrine. But the horrors of harem purification were just preparation for the main event. The fertility festivals where entire royal bloodlines participated in ceremonies that would violate every modern standard of human decency. The Feast of Divine Renewal occurred every 7 years and required the participation of all living members of the royal family in ceremonies designed to reinforce pharaonic bloodline purity through practices that modern genetics would classify as systematic inbreeding combined with ritualized sexual violence. When the festival began in 1279 BCE under Ramesses II, 43 members of the royal family gathered in specially constructed chambers beneath the Karnak temple complex for 2 weeks of ceremonies that transformed religious celebration into organized sexual assault. The theological foundation for these festivals rested on Egyptian beliefs about divine bloodline preservation that required regular renewal through extreme sexual practices. Priests taught that pharaonic divinity could only be maintained through bloodline concentration that preserved divine essence from generation to generation. The more closely related the participants, the more divine energy their union would generate. This religious framework provided justification for practices that violated every natural boundary of human relationships. The preparation for fertility festivals involved months of planning that reveals the systematic nature of royal sexual violence. Palace administrators compiled detailed genealogical charts mapping relationships between all royal family members. Priests calculated optimal pairings based on bloodline proximity and astrological considerations. Medical specialists prepared drugs and instruments necessary for ceremonies that would inflict significant physical trauma on participants. The festival chambers were constructed according to specifications that prioritized acoustic amplification and visual documentation of the proceedings. Stone amphitheaters allowed observers to witness every detail of the ceremonies from multiple angles. Specially designed acoustics ensured that sounds generated during the festivals would reach the ears of gods dwelling in temple upper chambers. The architecture itself was designed to transform private acts into public spectacles for divine consumption. The actual ceremonies combined elements of religious ritual, medical procedure, and sexual assault in ways that systematically violated every participant, regardless of age or family relationship. Young members of the royal family were initiated through procedures that would constitute child abuse by any modern standard. Adult participants were forced to engage in acts that violated fundamental human boundaries, while priests documented every detail for religious archives. The drug protocols for fertility festivals involved substances that created artificial arousal while maintaining consciousness throughout extended ceremonies. Medical papyri described pharmaceutical preparations that could sustain physical responses for hours while preventing participants from losing awareness of their situation. The chemical knowledge required to produce these effects demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human physiology applied to maximize both pleasure and suffering simultaneously. The documentation requirements for fertility festivals generated archives that provide disturbing insight into the systematic nature of royal sexual violence. Priests maintained detailed records of participant responses, ceremony duration, and physical outcomes. Artists created explicit visual documentation that was considered as sacred as any religious artwork. These archives were preserved in temple complexes where they served as instructional materials for future festival preparations. The international implications of fertility festivals created diplomatic complications that reveal the extreme nature of these practices even by ancient standards. Foreign ambassadors invited to witness the ceremonies often requested immediate departure from Egypt. Trade partners questioned whether continued relations with Egypt were morally acceptable. Even societies that practiced their own forms of ritual violence expressed shock at the systematic nature of pharaonic sexual ceremonies. The psychological impact on royal family members who survived fertility festivals created generational trauma that influenced Egyptian court culture for centuries. Participants developed psychological disorders that modern medicine would classify as severe post-traumatic stress. Many royal children died from physical injuries sustained during the ceremonies. Those who survived often displayed behavioral patterns consistent with systematic sexual abuse. The evolution of fertility festivals over Egyptian history shows progressive escalation that mirrors the pattern seen in other pharaonic rituals. Early dynasties conducted relatively simple ceremonies focused on symbolic bloodline renewal. Later periods developed elaborate multi-week festivals involving increasingly extreme practices. The final iterations of these ceremonies under the Ptolemaic dynasty included elements so extreme that even sympathetic historians struggled to describe them. The religious justification for fertility festivals created theological frameworks that normalize systematic sexual violence within royal bloodlines while presenting these practices as essential for Egyptian survival. The Papyrus of Royal Renewal described pharaonic incest as necessary for preserving divine bloodlines. The Book of Sacred Union provided detailed instructions for ceremonies that combined religious ritual with systematic sexual assault. These texts were considered fundamental religious doctrine that guided royal behavior for over 2 millennia. But even the horror of fertility festivals pales before the ultimate expression of pharaonic perversion. The death ceremonies, where entire communities were sacrificed to ensure their god king's comfort in the afterlife. The great dying ceremonies represented the pinnacle of pharaonic megalomania, where entire settlements were systematically exterminated to provide their god king with adequate servants for eternity. When Khufu prepared for his final journey in 2566 BCE, the village of Kentika was selected for complete sacrifice. This wasn't a small hamlet of a few dozen people. Archaeological evidence reveals a thriving community of over 800 souls, including craftsmen, farmers, children, and elderly residents who had lived peacefully for generations. Within 3 days, every single person in Kentika would be dead, killed in carefully orchestrated ceremonies designed to transform an entire population into pharaonic property. The selection criteria for sacrifice villages followed calculated principles that maximized both the practical value and psychological impact of mass extermination. Communities chosen for the Great Dying needed to be economically self-sufficient, ensuring the pharaoh would have access to every type of skill and service in the afterlife. They also needed to be geographically isolated, preventing news of the impending massacre from spreading to other settlements. Most importantly, the villages had to demonstrate complete loyalty to pharaonic authority, making their betrayal and slaughter a demonstration of absolute divine power over even the most faithful subjects. The logistics of organizing mass human sacrifice required bureaucratic systems that operated with terrifying efficiency. Royal administrators spent months cataloging every resident of the selected village, assigning specific afterlife roles based on their earthly occupations. Priests calculated the precise timing necessary to kill hundreds of people while maintaining their spiritual viability for eternal service. Military commanders planned deployment strategies that could surround entire communities without allowing any escapes. The paperwork alone filled dozens of papyrus scrolls that detailed every aspect of systematic extermination. The preparation phase lasted exactly 40 days and transformed the condemned village into an open-air prison where residents awaited death while continuing their daily routines under constant surveillance. Egyptian soldiers established checkpoints around the settlement perimeter, preventing anyone from leaving while maintaining the illusion of normal life. Priests arrived to conduct purification ceremonies that were actually psychological conditioning, designed to make residents accept their fate willingly. Royal physicians examined every villager to determine optimal killing methods that would preserve their bodies for mummification and eternal service. The announcement ceremony reveals the calculated cruelty that characterized pharaonic death rituals. Village leaders were summoned to a special gathering where they expected to receive honors for their community's loyalty and service. Instead, they heard royal proclamations declaring their entire population selected for divine privilege of serving their god-king throughout eternity. The announcement was presented as tremendous honor that should inspire gratitude rather than terror. Villagers were told they had been chosen above all other communities to demonstrate their devotion through voluntary sacrifice. The psychological manipulation that followed the announcement demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human nature applied to facilitate mass murder. Priests conducted daily ceremonies celebrating the village's selection for eternal service. They distributed special foods and wines that contained drugs designed to induce compliance and reduce resistance. They organized festivals and entertainments that maintained normal social routines while gradually conditioning residents to accept their impending deaths as religious necessity rather than cold-blooded murder. The killing methods employed during great dying ceremonies were specifically designed to preserve bodies for mummification while minimizing resistance from victims. Poison was the preferred technique, administered through communal meals that ensured simultaneous death across the entire population. The substances used were carefully selected to cause peaceful unconsciousness, followed by respiratory failure without damaging organs needed for preservation. Medical papyri describe these poisons in clinical detail, including preparation methods and dosage calculations based on victim age and body weight. The timing of mass executions followed precise astronomical calculations that supposedly aligned the deaths with optimal conditions for souls to reach the afterlife. Priests consulted star charts and lunar cycles to determine exact moments when the barriers between worlds were thinnest. The killing had to begin at sunset and conclude before dawn, requiring military precision to murder hundreds of people within a 12-hour window. Any delays or complications could supposedly trap souls in limbo, making their eternal service impossible. The witnessing requirements for great dying ceremonies transformed mass murder into religious theater, where pharaohs demonstrated their divine authority through orchestrated genocide. The ruling monarch was required to personally observe the deaths of every sacrifice victim to claim ownership of their souls for eternity. Court officials documented the proceedings with detailed descriptions of each death, creating archives that preserved the names and final moments of entire exterminated communities. Artists created visual records of the ceremonies that were considered sacred artwork depicting divine power in action. The mummification process for sacrifice victims followed completely different procedures than those used for pharaohs or nobles. Speed was essential since hundreds of bodies needed preservation within days of death. Specialized teams of embalmers worked in assembly line fashion, removing organs and applying preservation chemicals with industrial efficiency. The goal wasn't elaborate decoration or individual care, but basic preservation that would maintain the bodies long enough for eternal service. Most sacrifice mummies were wrapped in simple linen and placed in mass burial chambers rather than individual tombs. The underground complexes designed to house sacrifice populations were architectural marvels that provided eternal prisons for entire communities. These subterranean cities contained separate chambers for different social classes, ensuring that village hierarchies would continue in the afterlife. Workshops were established where craftsmen could continue their trades throughout eternity. Agricultural areas allowed farmers to grow food for the pharaoh's eternal consumption. The scale of these underground facilities required decades of construction and massive investment of resources. The psychological impact on Egyptian society from regular great dying ceremonies created a culture of terror that influenced every aspect of daily life. Villages lived in constant fear of selection for sacrifice, leading to desperate attempts to avoid royal attention. Communities would hide their prosperity, conceal their skills, and downplay their loyalty to avoid being chosen for eternal service. The knowledge that devotion to the pharaoh could result in mass extermination created paradoxical relationships where subjects simultaneously worshipped and feared their divine ruler. The evolution of great dying ceremonies over Egyptian history shows progressive escalation in both scale and cruelty that mirrors other pharaonic rituals. Early dynasties sacrificed small groups of servants and craftsmen. Middle Kingdom pharaohs expanded to entire households and extended families. New Kingdom rulers began selecting complete villages for extermination. By the Ptolemaic period, some pharaohs were sacrificing multiple communities simultaneously, creating industrial-scale genocide disguised as religious ceremony. The international diplomatic consequences of great dying ceremonies created tensions that influenced Egypt's relationships with neighboring civilizations for centuries. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed these mass sacrifices carried accounts back to their rulers that portrayed Egypt as a nation of systematic murderers. Trade partners questioned the moral acceptability of conducting business with a civilization that practiced industrial genocide. Even allies expressed reservations about military cooperation with rulers who regularly exterminated their own loyal subjects. The economic impact of sacrificing entire communities created resource shortages that forced Egyptian administrators to develop increasingly sophisticated systems for managing human livestock. Royal bureaucrats maintained detailed census records of every village and settlement, calculating their value for potential sacrifice versus continued taxation and service. Agricultural specialists developed methods for rapidly replacing exterminated farming communities to prevent food shortages. Craft guilds established training programs to quickly reproduce skills lost when entire workshops were sacrificed for royal burials. The religious texts that governed great dying ceremonies provided theological justifications that transformed genocide into sacred duty while establishing bureaucratic procedures for mass murder. The Papyrus of Eternal Communities described the process for selecting and preparing entire populations for sacrifice. The Book of Divine Service provided detailed instructions for organizing mass executions while maintaining spiritual viability of victims. These documents were studied by priests and administrators with the same devotion given to fundamental religious teachings. The archaeological evidence for great dying ceremonies exists in multiple locations across Egypt, though much remains deliberately unexplored by modern researchers reluctant to confront the full extent of pharaonic genocide. Mass burial sites near major pyramid complexes contain remains of hundreds of individuals who died simultaneously from identical causes. Underground facility ruins show evidence of large-scale residential areas designed for permanent occupation by dead populations. Chemical analysis of preserved tissues reveals traces of the specific poisons used for mass executions during royal burial ceremonies. The survival accounts from great dying ceremonies are extraordinarily rare since the goal was complete extermination of target populations. However, scattered papyrus fragments preserve testimonies from Egyptian officials who participated in organizing these massacres. One administrator described the logistical challenges of killing 800 people in a single night. Another recorded his psychological struggles with ordering the deaths of children he had known personally. These fragments provide insight into the human cost of systematic genocide disguised as religious necessity. The comparison between great dying ceremonies and modern genocide reveals disturbing parallels in the methods used to normalize and facilitate mass murder. Egyptian priests developed ideological frameworks that portrayed systematic killing as religious duty essential for cosmic order. Administrative systems reduced individual human beings to statistical units that could be allocated and disposed of according to royal needs. Military organizations created specialized units trained specifically for conducting efficient mass executions of civilian populations. But the Great Dying was merely the foundation for even more elaborate expressions of pharaonic power over life and death. The torture festivals where entertainment value was extracted from human suffering before victims were finally granted the mercy of death. The Festival of Divine Justice occurred annually during the flood season and transformed systematic torture into public entertainment, where pharaohs demonstrated their power over human suffering through elaborate ceremonies designed to extract maximum agony from carefully selected victims. The festival of 1184 BCE under Rameses III involved over 200 prisoners who underwent weeks of progressively escalating torture, while thousands of spectators gathered to witness their prolonged destruction. This wasn't random violence or impulsive cruelty. These were carefully choreographed performances where human suffering became artistic expression, celebrating pharaonic authority over life, death, and everything in between. The victim selection process for torture festivals followed criteria that maximized both the entertainment value and political impact of systematic suffering. Prisoners of war provided exotic appeal since their foreign appearance, and unfamiliar languages created psychological distance that made their torture more palatable to Egyptian audiences. Political dissidents offered opportunities to demonstrate the consequences of challenging pharaonic authority. Religious heretics allowed priests to showcase divine justice, punishing those who rejected proper worship. But the most prized victims were former royal favorites, whose fall from grace provided dramatic narratives that enhanced the entertainment value of their destruction. The torture amphitheaters were architectural masterpieces designed specifically to optimize the viewing experience while maximizing victim suffering. These circular stone structures could accommodate thousands of spectators arranged in tiered seating that provided clear sightlines to central performance areas. Acoustic design amplified screams and other sounds of suffering to reach every audience member. Specialized lighting systems using polished bronze mirrors concentrated sunlight on torture platforms, creating dramatic visual effects while literally burning victims during their ordeals. The progression of torture techniques during festivals followed carefully planned schedules that built audience anticipation while extracting maximum suffering from each victim. The ceremonies began with relatively mild punishments that established baseline levels of pain and fear. Each subsequent day introduced new methods that escalated physical agony while maintaining victim consciousness. The climax typically occurred on the seventh day when victims finally received the mercy of death after a week of progressively intensifying torture that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. The medical support systems for torture festivals revealed the sophisticated planning required to maintain victims in states of controlled agony for extended periods. Royal physicians developed techniques for treating injuries that prevented death while allowing continued torture. Specialized drugs could maintain consciousness despite severe physical trauma. Surgical procedures could repair damage that might otherwise end victim suffering prematurely. The goal was keeping people alive and aware throughout the entire festival, regardless of the damage inflicted on their bodies. The audience participation elements of torture festivals transformed spectators from passive observers into active participants in systematic human destruction. Crowd voting determined which torture methods would be applied to specific victims. Wealthy spectators could purchase the right to personally inflict pain on prisoners using provided instruments. Children were encouraged to attend these festivals as educational experiences that taught proper respect for pharaonic authority through witnessing the consequences of resistance or disloyalty. The religious justification for torture festivals centered on concepts of divine justice that required public demonstration of pharaonic power over human suffering. Priests taught that gods demanded entertainment in the form of human agony to maintain cosmic balance. The more elaborate and prolonged the torture, the more divine favor it would generate for Egypt. Victims were portrayed as willing participants in religious ceremonies rather than unwilling subjects of systematic cruelty. Their suffering transformed into acts of worship honoring pharaonic divinity. The economic impact of torture festivals created entire industries dedicated to supporting systematic human suffering as public entertainment. Specialized craftsmen developed increasingly sophisticated torture instruments that could inflict precise amounts of pain without causing immediate death. Merchants imported exotic animals trained to participate in victim torture. Food vendors supplied refreshments to audiences who might spend entire days watching human beings slowly destroyed for their amusement. The psychological conditioning required to normalize torture festivals as acceptable entertainment reveals the systematic nature of Egyptian violence culture. Children were exposed to these spectacles from early ages, learning to view human suffering as normal and entertaining. Educational systems taught that foreign prisoners deserved whatever pain they received. Religious instruction portrayed torture as divine justice that good Egyptians should celebrate rather than question or resist. The documentation of torture festival procedures exists in multiple formats that confirm the systematic and bureaucratic nature of these events. Administrative papyri detail the supplies and personnel required for week-long torture ceremonies. Medical texts describe techniques for maintaining victim viability during extended ordeals. Artistic depictions preserve visual records of specific torture methods and audience reactions. These archives were maintained with the same care given to important state documents. The international diplomatic consequences of torture festivals damaged Egypt's relationships with neighboring civilizations who viewed these practices as evidence of Egyptian barbarism. Foreign ambassadors refused to attend torture festivals despite diplomatic pressure. Trade partners expressed moral objections to conducting business with a civilization that practiced entertainment torture. Military allies questioned their willingness to fight alongside armies led by rulers who regularly tortured prisoners for public amusement. The evolution of torture festivals over Egyptian history demonstrates progressive escalation in both cruelty and scale that characterized all pharaonic rituals. Early dynasties conducted simple executions with minimal ceremony. Middle Kingdom rulers developed basic torture techniques for special occasions. New Kingdom pharaohs established regular festival schedules with elaborate procedures. Ptolemaic dynasty festivals became week-long spectacles involving hundreds of victims and thousands of spectators in celebrations of systematic human destruction. The comparison between Egyptian torture festivals and modern forms of entertainment violence reveals disturbing continuities in human fascination with systematic suffering. Contemporary audiences consume violent media content while maintaining psychological distance from actual human pain. Egyptian spectators watched real torture while developing similar emotional detachment through cultural conditioning. The fundamental appeal of witnessing human suffering as entertainment appears to be a consistent aspect of human psychology that manifests differently across historical periods. The legacy of torture festivals influenced Egyptian culture for centuries after the practice officially ended, creating social norms that normalized violence and reduced empathy for human suffering. Generations raised attending these spectacles developed psychological patterns that made them more accepting of systematic cruelty in other contexts. The cultural celebration of human suffering became embedded in Egyptian society at levels that influenced everything from family relationships to international diplomacy. But torture festivals were merely public expressions of private perversions that pharaohs practiced in the hidden chambers of their palaces. The secret rituals where divine authority justified practices so extreme that even Egyptian priests struggled to document them without violating their own moral boundaries. The private chambers beneath pharaonic palaces contained horrors that surpassed even the public spectacles of torture festivals. These were the sacred spaces where pharaohs practiced rituals so extreme that court records refer to them only as the unspeakable devotions or ceremonies that cannot be witnessed by mortal eyes. In 1156 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses IV, renovation work on the palace foundations accidentally breached a sealed chamber that had been hidden for over 3 centuries. The workers who discovered it emerged screaming and refused to return underground. What they found was a laboratory of human experimentation disguised as religious practice. The chamber walls were covered in hieroglyphic instructions for procedures that read like surgical manuals written by madmen. Detailed anatomical diagrams showed how to keep human subjects conscious during organ removal. Step-by-step illustrations demonstrated techniques for inducing specific types of pain without causing immediate death. Chemical formulas described substances that could enhance suffering while preventing unconsciousness. These weren't the products of diseased imagination. They were scientific documents recording centuries of systematic experimentation on human beings. The preservation of living subjects for extended ritual use required medical knowledge that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Pharaonic physicians understood circulation well enough to control blood loss during surgical procedures. They knew which organs could be removed without causing immediate death. They developed life support techniques that could maintain consciousness in severely damaged bodies. This knowledge was applied not for healing, but for maximizing the duration and intensity of human suffering during private religious ceremonies. The victim selection for private rituals followed different criteria than public festivals. These chambers required subjects who could survive extended procedures while maintaining awareness throughout weeks or months of systematic abuse. Young, healthy individuals were preferred, but mental capacity was equally important. Pharaohs wanted victims who could understand what was happening to them, who could appreciate the divine power being demonstrated through their suffering. Intelligence made the torture more meaningful. The ritual progression in private chambers followed cycles that could extend for years rather than days. Subjects underwent daily procedures that gradually transformed their bodies while maintaining their consciousness and identity. The goal wasn't quick death or even prolonged torture. It was complete physical reconstruction that demonstrated absolute pharaonic power over human form and function. Victims became living sculptures of suffering, artistic expressions of divine authority over flesh and bone. The documentation of private rituals exists in coded hieroglyphic texts that took modern scholars decades to decipher. The language used metaphors and religious symbolism to describe procedures that were too extreme for direct documentation. References to reshaping divine vessels meant surgical modification of human bodies. Extracting sacred essences described organ removal from living subjects. Achieving perfect divine harmony indicated successful completion of procedures that left victims alive but fundamentally altered. The psychological preparation for private rituals involved months of conditioning that broke down victim resistance while maintaining their capacity for suffering. Subjects were isolated in luxury chambers where they received excellent food, comfortable accommodations, and kind treatment from servants. This psychological manipulation made their eventual torture more traumatic by contrasting their expectations with reality. Hope made the horror more intense. But even these private horrors pale before the ultimate revelation. The systematic breeding programs where entire bloodlines were cultivated specifically to produce optimal victims for pharaonic pleasure. Archaeological evidence from recently excavated palace complexes reveals nursery areas designed not for raising royal children, but for growing human livestock destined for ritual consumption. The breeding records preserved in palace archives detail genetic selection programs that operated for centuries. Pharaohs maintained detailed genealogies, tracking physical and psychological traits across multiple generations of captive populations. They bred for specific characteristics that enhanced ritual value: pain sensitivity, physical resilience, mental capacity, and aesthetic appeal. These human breeding programs were as sophisticated as any modern agricultural operation, except the crop was human suffering. The scale of these operations required massive infrastructure that archaeologists are only beginning to understand. Underground complexes beneath major palace sites contained residential areas for hundreds of breeding subjects. Educational facilities provided training for young victims destined for specific ritual purposes. Medical centers monitored the health and development of human livestock. Administrative offices managed the paperwork required to track multiple generations of captive bloodlines. The final revelation that makes everything else pale in comparison is the evidence that these practices didn't end with ancient Egypt. The techniques, the justifications, the bureaucratic systems developed by pharaohs to normalize systematic human suffering were preserved in secret texts that influenced later civilizations. The Roman emperors studied Egyptian methods. Medieval rulers adapted pharaonic justifications for divine authority. Even modern dictatorships have drawn inspiration from techniques first perfected in the land of the pharaohs. This isn't ancient history confined to dusty tombs. It's a blueprint for systematic evil that has influenced human civilization for over 3 millennia. The pharaohs didn't just rule Egypt. They created the template for absolute power justified through religious authority, demonstrated through systematic cruelty, and maintained through bureaucratic efficiency. Every dictator who has claimed divine mandate, every regime that has industrialized human suffering, every system that has reduced people to statistical units has followed paths first carved by Egyptian god kings. The evidence we've examined today represents only a fraction of what remains hidden in sealed chambers and restricted archives. Entire categories of pharaonic perversion remain unexplored because modern researchers lack the psychological preparation to confront evidence of systematic evil on this scale. The pharaohs perfected techniques for human suffering that make medieval torture look like amateur hour and modern atrocities seem like crude imitations of Egyptian innovation. Understanding this history isn't about satisfying morbid curiosity or shocking audiences with ancient horrors. It's about recognizing the patterns that enabled systematic evil to flourish for over 2,000 years. The pharaohs proved that human beings can normalize any level of cruelty when it's wrapped in religious authority and divine justification. They demonstrated how bureaucratic systems can industrialize suffering while maintaining the illusion of sacred purpose. The lessons from pharaonic Egypt echo through every subsequent attempt to create absolute authority justified through divine mandate. The techniques they developed for breaking human will, the systems they created for managing human livestock, the justifications they crafted for systematic cruelty have influenced rulers throughout history. Their legacy lives on in every regime that treats human beings as expendable resources for demonstrating power. So the next time you visit a museum and marvel at golden treasures and magnificent artwork, remember what funded those achievements. Every beautiful artifact was paid for with human suffering on a scale that defies modern comprehension. The civilization that created wonders also perfected horrors. The same hands that built pyramids also developed torture techniques that influenced sadists for millennia. The pharaohs' most perverse rituals have finally been revealed, but their ultimate legacy isn't the specific horrors they inflicted. It's the proof that human beings can justify any level of systematic evil when they believe themselves to be gods. That's the most terrifying revelation of all, because that capacity for divine self-deception didn't die with ancient Egypt. It lives on in every person who believes their authority places them above human moral boundaries. The monuments remain. The treasures endure. But the screams have finally found their voice in the archaeological evidence that can no longer be ignored. The pharaohs built eternity from human suffering, and now we know exactly what that cost.